Shut up, slave boy. No one asked you. The whole classroom went quiet. Not because they were shocked by the words, but because they were waiting to see how Elijah would react this time. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just clenched his fists under the table so tight, his knuckles turned pale white. His jaw tightened. His eyes didn't move, but his heart was pounding like a war drum in his chest. Ms. Ellison, their English teacher, stood frozen in front of the board, eyes flicking between Elijah and Logan, the golden-haired, blue-eyed quarterback who always got away with everything. "Elijah," she finally said, her voice soft, hesitant. "Do you want to step outside for a moment?" Elijah stood slowly, not because he was in trouble, but because he'd learned that when you're black and quiet, they call it threatening. When you're loud, they call it aggressive. When you defend yourself, they call it troublemaking. So he just stood, calm, measured, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Inside the classroom, a low chuckle escaped Logan's throat. "What? I was just kidding." A few kids laughed nervously. Some looked away. One girl, Melanie, bit her lip, looking toward the door Elijah had just exited through, guilt swimming in her eyes. Mrs. Ellison turned back to the board, her shoulders tense. "Let's get back to our discussion on To Kill a Mockingbird." Irony had officially left the room. Outside, Elijah leaned against the cold metal of the locker, staring at the floor. He wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not where they wanted him to. He had cried enough when they poured chocolate milk in his backpack, when they called his natural hair dirty and said he smelled like the hood, when they drew a noose on his locker last semester and the school called it a harmless prank. He was done crying. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his mom. "How's your day going, baby?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and walked toward the principal's office, not to report anything. That never worked. He was going to ask to speak at the next school assembly. Principal Cartwright looked up when Elijah knocked gently on the doorframe. "Hey, Elijah, everything okay?" Elijah nodded. "I want to request something." "All right," Cartwright gestured to the chair across from him. "I want to speak at the next school assembly. I know it's for student council usually, or announcements, but, I want to talk. I need to." Cartwright raised an eyebrow. "Can I ask what about?" Elijah met his gaze dead on. "What it's like being black in this school. Silence. The kind of silence adults use when they're both impressed and terrified." "Elijah," Cartwright began, choosing his words carefully. That's a big topic. I'm not saying no, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Elijah said, "more sure than I have been about anything." Word spread fast. By the end of the day, half the students were whispering about it. "Did you hear? Elijah's going to talk at the assembly. What's he going to say? Is he going to call everyone racist? He better not mention names. That's defamation." Logan laughed when he heard. "What's he going to do? Give a speech about how hard it is to be him?" "Boo-hoo." Melanie turned sharply. "You know what? Maybe you should shut up for once." He blinked. "Whoa. Since when are you on his side?" "Since always. I just never said it out loud." Logan smirked. "Whatever. He'll embarrass himself." Friday came. The gym was packed. Every student, every teacher, even some parents who'd heard about the speech. Elijah stood behind the curtain backstage, breathing slow and deep. His mom had pressed his shirt for him the night before. His little sister, Amara, had slipped a note in his lunchbox that said, "You're a lion." He felt like one now. "Ready?" Principal Cartwright asked, stepping beside him. Elijah nodded. When they called his name, the crowd murmured, confused. Some clapped. Most waited in tense silence. He walked onto the stage, heart pounding in his ears. He looked out at them, the same faces who laughed when he was humiliated, the same teachers who stayed quiet, the same classmates who watched him shrink. Day after day, he took the mic. And then he spoke. He took the mic. And then he spoke. "My name is Elijah Carter. Some of you know me as the quiet kid. Some of you know me as the angry black guy in second period. And some of you don't know me at all." His voice echoed through the gym. The sound system buzzed slightly. But no one moved. No one interrupted. I wasn't always quiet. When I was younger, I loved to talk. I asked questions. I laughed out loud in class. I raised my hand even when I didn't know the answer, just because I wanted to try. But this school, some of you taught me to be silent. He looked up, eyes scanning the crowd. There's this boy named Logan. Gasps rippled through the gym. Logan sat up straight, his mouth open slightly. I'm not saying this to shame him. I'm saying this because I'm done hiding. Last week, Logan called me a slave boy in front of everyone. And that wasn't the first time. It was just the last straw. Logan shifted uncomfortably. A teacher beside him whispered something in his ear. He brushed them off. But this isn't just about Logan. It's about what happens when he says that, and no one says anything. When you laugh, when you look down at your desk and pretend you didn't hear it, when the teacher moves on like nothing happened. A few students looked away. Others stared at Elijah, eyes wide, unmoving. I've been called names. I've had food thrown at me. Notes slipped in my locker with the N-word on them. Someone drew a noose on my locker last year, and the school said it was just a prank. You remember that, right? A murmur moved through the gym like a cold breeze, but I'm still here. His voice grew louder now. Stronger. I'm still here. Every day. I walk into this building knowing I might get humiliated. I might get mocked for how I speak, how I walk, how I exist. But I still show up. That takes strength. More strength than any of you will ever understand. A teacher near the back wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't want pity. I don't need apologies whispered in hallways when no one else is watching. I need change. I need this school to stop pretending it's inclusive because there's a Black History Month poster in the hallway. Students started shifting in their seats. Some began to lean forward. Melanie was sitting near the front, her hands shaking slightly as she listened. I want the kids who look like me to feel safe, to feel seen. I want to be treated like a person, not a stereotype. I want to walk into a classroom and not have to wonder if today's the day someone's going to make a joke about my skin, my hair, or my family. His voice cracked. I want to breathe. There was a long pause. No one spoke. No one whispered. No one laughed. I know some of you don't get it. Some of you think I'm being dramatic, that racism doesn't exist anymore, that I should just get over it. Well, I hope you never have to get over being treated like you're less than human. He looked toward Logan directly. I hope you never have to wonder if people are being nice to you because they like you or because they feel sorry for you. Then his gaze swept across the entire crowd. But most of all, I hope you listen. I hope you remember this moment, not because of me, but because you realized it's time to be better. He stepped back from the microphone, then paused. One last line. I'm Elijah Carter, and I'm done being silent. He turned and walked off stage, and the gym stayed completely silent. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. They were stunned, still, silent. Even Logan. Elijah walked backstage, his chest rising and falling fast. He had done it. He had said every word he meant to say, and none of it felt like enough. But it also felt like everything. Principal Cartwright met him in the hallway. He looked stunned. That was powerful. Elijah, he said quietly, more powerful than anything I've heard on this stage in 20 years. Elijah nodded, still catching his breath. Thank you for letting me speak. Cartwright looked like he wanted to say more, but didn't know how. Go get some water. Take a minute. You earned it. Elijah walked out through the side door and into the cool breeze outside the gym. He sat on the steps, a moment of peace, of silence this time, the good kind. Inside, the students sat frozen for several seconds before Melanie stood up, slowly, and began clapping. One, then two, then the entire front row joined, and then the next row. And then the teachers. The gym erupted in applause, but Elijah didn't see it. He wasn't waiting for it. Because the truth was, he didn't need their validation. He needed their change. Later that day, in the hallway between 5th and 6th period, Logan approached Elijah, Everyone watched. Elijah, he said. Standing just a few feet away, Elijah turned, looking him straight in the eye. No fear, no hate, just expectation. Logan looked around, then lowered his voice. Look, what I said. The stuff I've done. He paused. I didn't think it was that big of a deal, but I listened to your speech. And I didn't realize how bad it's been. For you. Elijah raised an eyebrow. And now you do. I don't know, Logan admitted, but I want to try. I mean, if you'd ever be cool with, like, talking or showing me what I've been missing. Elijah blinked. That was the last thing he expected. I don't need to teach you, he said, but I won't stop you if you want to learn. Logan nodded. It wasn't a hug, it wasn't an apology, but it was something. At lunch, a group of students moved over, making room for Elijah at a table where he usually ate alone. Melanie waved him over. You were amazing, she said, as he sat down. Thanks, he said quietly. A freshman girl at the end of the table leaned in. My brother's black, she said. He got suspended for something a white kid started. It made me think of him. What you said. I'm glad you said it. Elijah gave a small smile. Thanks. Across the cafeteria, whispers buzzed this time, not cruel ones. He stood up there like a freaking superhero. I didn't know that stuff happened to him. I feel awful. We gotta do something. A teacher, Miss S. Kapoor, sent an email to all staff later that evening, after today's speech by Elijah Carter. I believe it's time we re-examine how we're handling racial incidents in our school. I propose we establish a student equity council and bring in outside voices to train both staff and students. The principal approved it within 48 hours. At home that night, Elijah sat at the dinner table with his mom and little sister. She placed a bowl of mac and cheese in front of him and kissed the top of his head. I saw the video, she whispered. They uploaded it on the school's page. Elijah stared at his plate. You made your daddy proud today, she said, tears in her eyes. And you made me proud every day before that, too. Amara giggled. You're famous now. Everyone at my school was talking about you. He smiled for the first time all day. But deep down, he knew it wasn't about fame. It was about finally being heard. The next week, Elijah walked into school and saw a poster on the wall. Student Equity Council. Join the movement. Your voice matters. Underneath it, someone had written in Sharpie, inspired by Elijah Carter. His chest swelled, not with pride, but with purpose. 3 weeks later, Elijah sat at the front of the school library beside a whiteboard with the words Student Equity Council. First meeting scribbled in green marker. 9 students showed up. 4 were black. 2 were Latino. 1 was Asian. 2 were white. He didn't care about the count. He cared that they came. Melanie sat next to him, flipping open her notebook. You nervous? Not really, Elijah said. I mean, yeah, but also no. Melanie smiled. That's comforting. Elijah stood up, looked at everyone sitting around the big wooden table, and spoke. Okay, thanks for coming. I didn't think anyone would show up, honestly. But here you are. A girl from the sophomore class raised her hand. Do we need permission to start, like, actual change? Elijah shook his head. We already have it. Principal Cartwright said he'd support anything we come up with if we're serious. A tall boy with glasses, Omar, leaned forward. Then, let's be serious. Let's talk about the bathroom graffiti, the jokes in the hallways, the subtle stuff, not just the big stuff, Melanie added. And the curriculum. Why do we only talk about black people in February? Why do we never hear about Latinx scientists or Asian activists? The ideas poured in. Someone suggested monthly culture spotlights. Someone else said they'd work with teachers to reframe the literature selections. Another student wanted to organize school-wide discussions. By the end of the meeting, the library didn't feel like a place for books. It felt like a battlefield for something better. Meanwhile, outside the walls of that library, change was already brewing. The video of Elijah's speech had hit over 300,000 views after being shared by a local education nonprofit. News stations called the school asking for interviews. Elijah refused them all. He didn't want to be a trending topic. He wanted change where it mattered, in the hallways, in the classrooms, in the hearts of the students sitting silently for far too long. In second period, English, Mrs. Ellison started her lesson with a new discussion prompt. How does silence enable injustice? This time, students raised their hands. They had things to say now. Even Logan, he cleared his throat. I think silence protects the people who do harm. I know I've done that before, and I don't want to anymore. No one mocked him. No one laughed. Because somehow, in the span of a few weeks, the school had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to feel different, enough to breathe. One afternoon, Principal Cartwright pulled Elijah aside. You've started something, son, he said. You know that. Elijah smiled faintly. I didn't mean to. Well, that's how real movements begin, Cartwright said. Someone just tells the truth, loud enough, long enough, and the world tilts a little. Elijah looked out the window at the courtyard where kids of all backgrounds now sat in mixed groups, where eyes didn't dart away so fast, where silence wasn't so dangerous anymore. Still a long way to go, he said. Yes, Cartwright agreed. But thanks to you, we've started walking. One evening, Elijah stood in front of his bathroom mirror, brushing his hair. Amara appeared in the doorway, her face peeking through. Hey, Elijah. Yeah. You know how you said people used to treat you like you were invisible? He nodded, toothbrush paused in hand. I see you, she said softly. Always have. He bent down and hugged her, tightly. That weekend, Elijah sat in his room, staring at a blank page in his journal. At the top, he wrote, Things I want to say before I graduate. He paused, then wrote the first line, You can't fix what you won't name. He smiled and kept writing. It was just after winter break when someone spray painted the words, Go back to Africa on the back of the gym wall. Big, bold black letters. The janitor found it at 6:17 a.m. By 7:00, it had already spread through student group chats. By 8:00, Elijah was sitting in the principal's office again. This wasn't aimed at you directly, Cartwright said, nervously smoothing his tie. But I'm the only black student who gave a speech to the entire school about racism. So now I'm the face of all of it. Right, Elijah finished. Cartwright looked pained. Elijah, I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology, Elijah said. I'm looking for action. Cartwright nodded. We're investigating. We've already got the footage. But I wanted to ask, would you be willing to speak again at the next assembly? Elijah hesitated. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. So tired. But then he remembered something his mom once told him. The hardest part about being a voice is knowing when to rest and when to roar. He looked up. I'll speak, he said. But this time, I'm not standing up there alone. The second assembly was scheduled for that Friday. But this time, Elijah didn't stand on that stage by himself. Beside him stood Melanie, Omar, the girl from sophomore year named Daniela, two teachers, even Logan. They all stood behind him like a wall that would not let hatred pass. Elijah stepped up to the mic again, but this time, his voice didn't shake. You all know what happened, he began. You saw the photo, the words, the hate, silence. But let me tell you something I've learned since the first time I stood on this stage. Hate can't survive being seen. He turned slightly, looking at the group behind him. These people behind me. They didn't just post about it. They showed up. They stood up. They walked into uncomfortable conversations. They made space. They listened. He looked out at the crowd. You don't have to be black to be outraged. You don't have to be the target to care. You just have to be human. Omar stepped forward. My name is Omar. I've been told to go back too, even though I was born in Chicago. Laughter rippled gently. Not cruel, but in solidarity. Melanie spoke next. I used to be quiet when people said racist things. Not anymore. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is a side. Then Logan stepped forward. I was part of the problem. I'm not proud of that. but I am proud that I'm trying to change, and I'll spend the rest of this year making it right. The room was still again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was listening, truly listening. After the assembly, a girl named Jada, a black freshman, walked up to Elijah near the water fountain. She looked shy, nervous. Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course," Elijah said. Stepping to the side, "My first week here, someone made fun of my braids, said I looked like Medusa. I didn't tell anyone. But after your first speech, I felt like maybe I wasn't alone." He didn't know what to say, so he just said the truth. "You're not." She smiled. "Thanks. I signed up for the Equity Council. Hope that's okay." "It's more than okay," he said. "It's the whole point." That night, Elijah sat with his journal again. He flipped to the page he'd started earlier. He wrote, "Hate survives in the dark, but so do seeds, and we're growing something here." Then he closed the book and turned off the light. And for the first time in months, Elijah Carter slept peacefully. The sky was a sharp blue on graduation day. No clouds, no breeze, just a sea of caps and gowns shimmering under the May sun, and hundreds of families packed into the football field bleachers. Elijah sat in the third row from the front, hands on his knees, fingers twitching. He hadn't expected anything today. He was just planning to walk across the stage, grab his diploma, and maybe hug his mom a little too tight. But then, halfway through the ceremony, Principal Cartwright stepped to the mic with a small card in his hand and cleared his throat. There are moments in a school's history that leave behind more than grades, test scores, or trophies. There are moments when a single student changes everything, not by yelling, but by speaking truth. Not by demanding attention, but by earning respect. Elijah looked up, heart suddenly hammering. Cartwright continued, "This year, we've decided to begin a new tradition. A tradition of honoring a graduating student who has made an extraordinary impact on the heart of this school." He paused. "And the first recipient of the Carter Courage Award is Elijah Carter." The crowd erupted into applause. Elijah froze. Melanie elbowed him, tears in her eyes. Go. He stood up slowly, stunned, his legs slightly trembling as he walked toward the podium. His mom was already crying in the second row. Amara was bouncing in her seat, yelling, "THATS, my brother." Cartwright handed him the glass award, simple, clear, and engraved with his name, and whispered, "You earned this a long time ago." Then stepped back. Elijah looked out over the crowd. Hundreds of students, parents, teachers, and a silence waiting to be filled. So for the last time, he spoke. "When I first came to this school, I thought I just had to survive. Keep my head down. Stay small enough to not be noticed, but not so small that I disappeared." He held the mic tight. "Then I got bullied, called things I won't repeat today, laughed at, ignored, and for a long time, I believed the lie that maybe I wasn't enough." He paused. The wind picked up slightly. Someone in the back sniffled. But then something changed. I spoke, and for the first time, people listened. And once they listened, something even crazier happened. They started to care. His voice was steady now, certain. "I'm not the only one who's been hurt here, but I'm proud to be one of the first who stood up and said, 'Enough. We deserve more.'" He turned, looked directly at the seniors. "You're walking out of here today with diplomas. But what I hope you carry with you is something heavier, something harder. I hope you carry courage." Then, finally, he smiled. Because courage doesn't always sound like a roar. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper that says, "I'll try again tomorrow." He stepped back, and this time the crowd stood. Every single person, not in shock, not out of guilt, but out of respect. The applause thundered across the field. Elijah looked down at the award in his hand, his name glowing in the sunlight. And for the first time in his life at that school, he felt tall. After the ceremony, as people crowded around him for hugs and photos, Logan came up quietly, dressed in his gown, holding out a hand. Elijah stared at it for a second, then shook it. "I still have a long way to go," Logan said. "So do I," Elijah replied. And they smiled, two boys from different worlds, now walking toward the same one. That night, Elijah sat on the hood of his mom's car with Amara curled up next to him, looking up at the stars. "You're gonna miss high school?" she asked. He laughed. "Not even a little." She giggled. "What now?" He looked at the stars, at the quiet, at the future. "Now," he whispered. "Now. I speak louder.